Welcome everyone to actually the first talk in our department's distinguished speaker series, first talk of this academic year. Before introducing our speaker for today, I just wanted to alert everyone to the next talk in this series, or the next one that's currently scheduled, which is we will have Professor Adam Getachew here speaking on April 4th. Hopefully that will be an in-person talk. We'll obviously adjust as needed, but please enter that into your calendars. Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to virtually welcome Dr. Abbey Steele today for her talk here, and I'll keep my introduction quite brief, but so that we have more time to hear from her and have a conversation with her about the work. But I'll just point out that Abbey is a leading expert in the field in the study of civil war, and particularly in civil war's impact on forced migration. She's also done incredibly interesting work on state building processes really spanning the world. Much of her work has been on Latin America, but she also has done work on state building in pre-modern Japan, and also on conceptualizing state capacity in innovative ways, including the way in which state capacity can vary within a political unit, within a country, and helping us conceptualize how that kind of heterogeneity within states. Abbey's the author of the Cornell University Press book, Democracy and Displacement in Colombia's Civil War, as well as of articles in the APSR, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, ISQ, and many other leading outlets. Abbey's talk today is going to build on her work on civil war, her large existing body of work on civil war, but I think she can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think takes it in a somewhat sort of new direction by examining the effects of the governing strategies that rebel groups used during civil war on patterns of citizens' political participation that we see after war. With that, I will turn things over to Abbey, and I think she's going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then that should leave us plenty of time for conversation afterwards. So, Abbey, please take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. Can everyone hear me and see my slides? Okay. I'm sorry, I was just kicked out of the meeting. Hopefully that won't happen again. Hopefully it's resolved, whatever the problem was. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to speak. I'm very excited to join you. Just really honored for the invitation. I'm going to talk as Ellen probably said while I was kicked out, about rebel governance and political participation, but I also, which is joint work with Michael Weintraub at the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. But I wanted to also give you a sense of this paper in a broader context of an ongoing project. And so I want to introduce and contextualize that project for you, and then I will talk about some of the findings that we've had so far and how we were wrong about our expectations. But I also would be happy to answer questions while I'm speaking if you raise your hand. And so I'm also happy to handle it that way. Again, hopefully I won't be kicked out. So the project, this paper is part of a broader project related to the historic peace agreement reached in Colombia in 2016 between the FARC rebel group, which existed for, since the early 1960s, and the government of Colombia. And it was historic for multiple reasons, but two big ones were that there had been numerous attempts previously to reach an agreement between the FARC and the Colombian government. And the agreement that was reached was very comprehensive. So one of the most comprehensive peace agreements to resolve a civil war ever adopted. But the process took some convincing for the Colombian public. The government decided to try to legitimize the peace agreement through a plebiscite or a referendum that was organized for October 2nd in 2016. And here you see a poster of a campaign against voting in favor of accepting the peace agreement. And the no campaign won the referendum, surprised many people and especially pollsters. But one thing to keep in mind is that it was defeated by only a tiny margin of 0.05%. So I think if it were held on a different day, it would have passed, but it still would be maybe questioning the legitimacy of the agreement itself. Very soon afterwards, thousands of people mobilized in Colombia and demonstrated for days in order to show support for the agreement. Nonetheless, the government and the FARC agreed to have a kind of open call for suggestions. Hundreds of comments came in, they organized them, they met and they made some adjustments to the agreement and passed it through Congress then. So there were many points at which the public participated in an indirect way in the peace agreement and its adoption. More generally, to situate the sort of questions that are raised, we can think of multiple things that the peace agreements raise for politics, including, what kind of new regimes are formed as a result of them, but more commonly among comparativists and international relations scholars, we ask sort of under what conditions are peace agreements successful? Under what conditions do they really keep parties to the commitments in the agreement? We can even think more broadly in contemporary terms about the connections between peace building implied by these agreements, along with democratic state building, given the common emphasis on holding elections and implementing kind of legitimate governance once an agreement is adopted. And we also ask in this project, maybe more narrowly, how ordinary civilians shape and respond to the efforts to create peace agreements, to maintain them, and then ultimately to create a new and stable peace. More specifically, in the Colombian context, we can ask many questions, but about the accords themselves. So the accords, as I mentioned, are among the most comprehensive ever adopted. There are 5 huge themes. I think it's about a 400-page document. One theme is political participation. The next is agricultural development and reform. There's another on the illicit economy, which I'm happy to talk about in the question and answer in terms of the role that plays in securing peace in Colombia. And then we have a transitional justice measures and reparations to victims, and then demobilization and reintegration of the FARC EP, the insurgency. There's a particular kind of historic context of this agreement in Colombia. As I mentioned, this is not the first time that an agreement was attempted or a demobilization sort of carried out in Colombia. And for a lot of Colombians, and I think a lot of ordinary civilians and political elites are well aware that in previous attempts to demobilize insurgencies, it didn't go well, and in fact led to a big, let's say, counterproductive outcomes. So many demobilized insurgents joined paramilitary counterinsurgent groups following demobilization in the early 1990s. And democratization reforms, as I write about in my first book, sparked a real increase in violence in the Civil War rather than becoming new institutions to navigate conflict and reduce violence. So I think that this the agreement is taking place with this kind of heavy historical background. This agreement, though, they decided that they were going to try to make it concrete and implement it in these 16 regions that are highlighted on the map, known in Colombia as PEDETs, which are just the regions where these big themes are going to be directed. They were chosen by the FARC and the government because they were most affected by the war and had maybe the most weak sort of stronghold of the state or presence of the state that could guarantee the rule of law. So this raises a lot of questions for us as academics, but international actors were also really interested and committed to the process, although very differently in Colombia than in other civil war settings. The UN was very active, but for instance, there are no peacekeepers in the Colombian context. But the UNDP is one of the leading branches of the UN in Colombia, supporting the peace agreement. And for, there was, as sometimes happens, there was a deputy director in the office who was particularly interested in knowing more about the residents of these PEDET regions and what their views were of the peace agreement and how implementation was going. And so he partnered with colleagues at PRIO in Oslo and Michael and I to start surveys in these regions and to design them and to field them in order to get a sort of sense of, as I said, how residents were viewing the peace agreement, how it was varying across these regions and over time, how it was related to the implementation of the agreement, if that implementation maybe would be raising hopes, but also establishing or sort of, making people more satisfied with the peace agreement and hopefully contributing to securing the peace. And we also wanted to know sort of how residents were going to be engaging with the peace process itself. So we've been working on this for quite a long time, and part of the idea is that the survey will also inform policymaking in Colombia and allow policymakers to adjust or give them some tools in order to adjust implementation as necessary. So that's the sort of genesis of this survey project, which I didn't mention, but it's called Monitoring Attitudes, Perceptions, and Support for the Peace Agreement in Colombia. So we call it the MAP survey. We sampled enough respondents so that we would have representativity at the PEDET level, so across these 16 regions. And we've fielded now 2 waves of the survey, so it's a panel survey. The first wave was implemented in 2019 with just over 12,000 respondents. And the second wave was carried out this summer with nearly 12,000 respondents, of whom nearly 8,000 were recontacted from the first wave. This is a photo from our field, the first wave of the survey in Chaparral, which is in Tolima, Colombia, to give you a sense of one of the communities we visited. I'm going to just introduce a bit the survey, in part because we will come back to it later with our analysis, but also because it's, I think, important to know that we want this survey to be used by other scholars. So I'm hoping to just also pitch it to all of you for your own ideas to use in the future. So the modules included in the survey range from demographic and socioeconomic data to questions about trust and political participation, the peace agreement and perceptions of the peace agreement with the FARC and its implementation, wartime experiences, transitional justice, sort of attitudes about transitional justice, and then about community needs in general, more related to public goods access, and then prospects for the future. So going back now, sort of coming closer to a research question that we will discuss from this paper. As I mentioned, political participation is a key aspect of the peace agreement. And within that big component of the peace agreement, There are mechanisms to expand representation, both of victims and the FARC. So the victims should have certain seats for representation within Congress, although Congress has not adopted that and implemented it yet. There were also mechanisms to transition the FARC to a political party and allow former commanders to also stand for public office. There are mechanisms to try to create an equal or more equal playing field among candidates and political parties, so public access to media, for example, and to try to encourage electoral participation by increasing registrations to vote and things like this. So the MAP survey allows us to see over time if in fact especially the electoral participation is improving, and other forms of participation that I will talk about. But we can also ask how political participation varies with wartime experiences. So before most of the measures are actually implemented in the Pedets, unfortunately, even though we started in 2019, most things had not yet been implemented in the Pedets. So we can ask sort of how do attitudes about participation relate to wartime experiences in these communities. And we know that during war, of course, civilians experience governance by rebels and militias and criminal groups, which we are just referring to here as rebel governance. There's been just an amazing research agenda fostered very recently, I mean, within the last 10 years on rebel governance. And now we are learning quite a lot about how civilians experience this during civil war, but we know a lot less about the implications of these governance strategies for how citizens and residents and civilians participate in post-conflict politics, or if they have any implications at all. But given all the amazing and rich work on rebel governance, we think that it should have an effect on post-war political behavior, especially in a context like Colombia, where the armed groups existed for decades. So it was not a short civil war, but quite a long one, where there would be quite a lot of time to generate socialization processes. So I can talk more specifically about the literature, but what we are doing in this paper is trying to do two things in particular. So we're first conceptually and empirically disaggregating what we mean by political engagement. And second, we're theorizing the impact of different forms of rebel government or governance on different forms of post-conflict political engagement. So I will walk you through these now. So our first sort of distinction in political participation is between what we're calling formal and informal. So for us, we're thinking of formal engagement along the lines of sort of state-based modes of engagement and participation, like voting and contacting politicians or officials of the state. And that is in contrast to informal engagement, where we're referring to political activity primarily outside of state-based institutions, such as protesting, striking, or participating in civil society organizations. Some other scholars like Centralized have also sort of disaggregated forms of political participation, but they mostly consider it electoral and non-electoral. And we think that in this context, at least formal and informal captures a bit better the sort of relationship with the state and its institutions. So in terms of rebel governance and theorizing about how rebel governance may influence these sort of individuals' decisions to participate formally or informally in politics in the post-conflict setting, we think that two characteristics are really important. As I told you before, I will repeat again, we turned out to be wrong, but I'm still going to tell you what we thought we would observe, and then show you that we were wrong and talk about some ideas for why we think we are wrong. But so we thought that two things from the literature, two dimensions from the literature were really important in this case. So the first would be the armed groups' approach to governance. So whether or not they engage in centralized or shared governance over a community, and I will talk about what that means in a moment, and the armed group's position relative to the state, whether or not it was anti or pro-state. So in Colombia, we have both anti and pro-state paramilitaries and insurgent groups who are anti-state or who are sort of contesting the state at least. And we have groups that Andres Vargas, who wrote his PhD dissertation, uncovered some interesting comparisons across armed groups in Colombia that included what he called polycentric governance. So this is when an armed group was sharing governance with existing community organizations. So not that it was not coercive, but that they expected community members to participate in decision-making and in the creation and maintenance of public goods like roads, versus more centralized approaches to armed group governance, which essentially replaced those community institutions and directly governed civilians living in the area, just mandating what they did without very much sort of give and take between the armed group and the community. So we think these two dimensions of armed group governance should have different kind of effects on the likelihood of individuals who experience this governance to participate differently following civil war. So centralized versus shared governance, we thinking, especially from shared governance, we think that the main distinction is the extent to which civilians are involved in decision-making and also expected to participate in local affairs. The centralized approach, we think, would encourage more independent forms of participation, whereas shared governance really emphasizes collective forms of political engagement, which we think might lead to new beliefs about collective forms of political action, but also norms at the community level about how to engage and solve local problems, especially with public goods and distribution. With the dimension of whether or not the armed group is in favor or against the state, we think that these groups, or that distinction, would encourage people living in these areas, so especially if they are pro-state, to actually use the state institutions and to participate in them, even if they are more centralized armed group, that they would sort of mandate participation in elections, for example, because those were state institutions. And that should also influence the perceptions about the legitimacy of these institutions. Whereas anti-state organizations might foster more independent collective local action, or even just independent action if they are more centralized if they have more centralized governance mechanisms. So this table sort of summarizes our expectations at the outset. So on this one dimension, we have the governance ideology is either shared or centralized. I'm not sure ideology is the perfect word here, maybe practices or institutions. And here on this other dimension, we have the anti-state and pro-state. And our sort of strongest expectations are that armed groups that are anti-state, that engage in shared governance, are likely to be associated with an increase in informal political participation following war, regardless of whether or not, if a person lived in a community under shared anti-state rule, compared to an individual who didn't experience rebel governance during the war. Whereas a pro-state centralized armed group would be most likely to be associated with an increase in formal political participation compared to people who did not experience rebel governance at all during the war. So those are our strongest expectations. And then we sort of expect that a shared governance, a pro-state group would increase both forms of political participation, and a centralized anti-state group would decrease both forms of political participation. In the context of Colombia, this allows us, we really are going to focus on testing these two stronger expectations because the FARC is arguably a shared, an organization that was anti-state that engaged most prominently in shared governance practices, whereas the paramilitaries were pro-state and most often engaged in centralized governance practices. So this is especially drawing on the work, again, of Andres Vargas, who mapped this in his dissertation. So we're going to use the MAPS survey to try to test our expectations. And to do that, we created two indices, but also I will show you results from the items of these indices. The first index is the formal participation, where we include whether an individual responded to any of the following things, including contacting a local leader, contacting a politician, voting in the peace referendum, and voting in the most recent legislative election. So we're using the 2019 wave here, and that would have been in 2018. So you see that about 77%, not about, 77% of our sample responded yes to at least one of these items. So there's relatively in our sample a high level of participation, and that's driven mostly by reported voting behavior. So 64% of our sample said that they voted in the most recent legislative elections, for example. The informal participation index just comes out of participation. If you said yes to participation in protests, membership in an NGO or a victims organization or a village action board, which are known as the HACs in Colombia. And here you see that only about 27% of our respondents said yes to at least one of these items, to give you a sense of the variation. Now, to measure rebel governance, and again, we're going to sort of group them differently based on our qualitative coding of which kind of group, what kind of governance they engaged in. But we asked respondents different ways. We tried to measure rebel governance in different ways. The simplest, cleanest measure is just we asked people, did the FARC, the ELN, and the paramilitaries ever rule your community before the peace agreement was signed? And they could say yes or no to each actor. And here's the distribution of the people who said, you know, that only FARC, that they said yes to the FARC and no to the other two. So 13% of our sample said that they experienced only FARC rule, 5% experienced ELN rule, which is another insurgent group that is still fighting, but much smaller than the FARC. More than a third of our sample experienced paramilitary rule only, 14% experienced all groups, and 46% did not say yes to any of the groups having ruled their community. So we're going to use these measures and engage in an individual level analysis. So to see if there's an association between what people reported experiencing in terms of who ruled their community and the kind of participation they also report engaging in more recently. So we include fixed effects at municipal and cadet levels, The standard errors are clustered at the neighborhood level for those of you who are interested in these things. And we include several individual level controls that may also contribute to political participation drawn from the literature, including gender, occupation, education, age, if they're living in the more urban area of these quite rural regions, and whether or not they were direct victims of violence during the war. So we can talk about that later. That's also another prominent, we think a prominent influencer of political participation. And then we just run an OLS estimator. And I'm just going to show you the two figures with our main results and talk about them a little bit. So the FARC only governance, as you can see here, this is, excuse me, for informal participation. So unlike what we expected, the FARC influence over informal governance is not very strong. In fact, it's not statistically significant at the 95% level. And once we sort of disaggregate the index, so here is the key down here. So the blue diamond is, have you participated in a protest in the last 6 months? Are you a member of an activist group? Are you a member of a victims organization? And are you a member of the Village Action Council? You see that this is mixed, but with in general, there's an association that is higher for having protested or being a higher likelihood of protesting and being a member of the victims organization and being a member of the Junta de Acción, the Village Action Council. The ELN, we don't see a very strong effect other than with reported protests. With the paramilitary only governance, we also were very surprised to find quite a high association with informal participation based on our measure of it. And so this represents a 30% difference between someone who reported paramilitary only governance and someone who reported not experiencing governance at all, in terms of the increase of participation in informal political participation. So that was rather surprising to us. If someone reported having experienced all governance, so having experienced all of the armed groups, they were statistically significantly less likely to participate in any informal mechanisms. And you see more sort of a washing out of combinations of other armed group rule. For formal participation, we were also surprised. Here we see people who reported FARC only governance to have a higher likelihood or to be more positively associated with formal participation than, again, compared to someone who reported no rebel rule. This represents substantively about a 10% difference in someone who reported no rebel rule. And we see that this is consistent across all of our items in the index, from contacting community leaders to voting in the plebiscite and the legislative vote. The ELN is much more mixed. And we see the paramilitaries, though, as we expected, are associated with higher or an increase in formal participation through across all of the mechanisms of the contacting community leader, somewhat less. The rest of the results are more mixed across the different combinations of the armed groups, but what really stood out to us is this strong association, positive association between FARC governance and formal participation on the one hand, and paramilitary governance and informal participation on the other. So two outcomes that we were not expecting. I will just briefly point out that for those of you who know Colombia well, this result about participating in the Junta de Acción Comunal between the FARC and the paramilitaries is consistent with what we think we know about paramilitary and FARC governance in these communities, that the FARC really relied on these juntas de acción comunal. They really co-opted them and transformed them and ruled through them and in partnership with them. Again, always with a coercive bent in the background, whereas paramilitaries were much less likely to do that. So it gives us a little bit of confidence that we are measuring what we hope to be measuring. But again, the results were unexpected. So to summarize, there's association with all types of rebel governance, unless they experience multiple forms of governance, I should say, that there is a kind of, at least to us, it was a surprising association between both formal and informal, political engagement. And so, of course, this prompts new questions for us, and we can start with sort of how robust are these results, and have we characterized and measured the types of participation well? And we can do some checks further down the line to try to account for that and make sure, but we think we are measuring participation well. We could maybe consider taking items out, but as you saw, the items themselves are pretty consistent with what the overall index is pointing to. It's possible that we are missing confounding effects in our analysis. And so one prominent one is this is a table that I just copied straight from our draft paper, which I should also say I'm happy to share with anyone who would like to read it. But we have a very high percentage of internally displaced people in our sample. So more than half of our sample is internally displaced. And it could be the case that especially the informal mechanism of socialization, but especially norms, like a norm-based collective participation in protests or in community organizations may be really dependent on remaining within your original community rather than being willing to engage in those same forms of collective political behavior in a brand new community or relatively new community. And here we do find that when if we take the IDPs out of the analysis about whether or not the FARC is likely to increase the association with informal political engagement, there we do see a positive association. So it may be that internally displaced people just don't feel comfortable enough to engage informally in relatively new communities, or those bonds are broken in order to do that. But this is just a preliminary analysis. And you see that the other results don't really change. So that's really the only thing that's affected by taking the internally displaced population out of the analysis. So that's an example of the kind of exploratory work that we are still doing to try to sort out how reliable are these results that we found that are unexpected, and how we can think about them. Of course, another way to think about the unexpected results is that, well, maybe we actually characterize the armed groups poorly, so that it's fine to characterize in general between centralized and shared governance, but especially where maybe the FARC is concerned, maybe they weren't actually so anti-state. And this is in spite of them waging a war against it for decades. So this is, I think, an interesting line of work that I really recommend, actually, this recent paper by Peñaranda, Otero, and Uribe, who looked at a case study of building roads in Colombia. It's published in World Development, and looking at just how closely the FARC worked with and mobilized local state institutions, which they write had the effect of legitimating the FARC as representatives who secured benefits from the state for their social bases. And so it's sort of unpacking this set of assumptions about just how divided the insurgency was from state institutions, and sort of, yeah, makes us think differently maybe about how much overlapping work there was there with the FARC and also local politicians, especially they were focused on a region in the south of Colombia, but also in Putumayo, further south. There were lots of evidence of the FARC sort of collaborating with and making demands of local state officials. The FARC also regularly educated and socialized residents living in their territories about their constitutional rights. So it wouldn't be actually, when I've done field work and I've met with people who live for many years in regions that were under the control of the FARC, and they even pull out a copy of the Constitution, right? And that almost immediately signals that they've been socialized under the FARC, because it's not very typical for someone to be carrying a copy of the Constitution, actually. And they know the laws very well. So they can tell you the state is violating this or that law because they talk about it in their meetings, and the FARC is telling them they need to make these demands. So it's, in a way, I'm starting to think that maybe there's something legitimating about that process as well for the state, that their rights and what they're entitled to should be fulfilled by the state, and that the state is just failing, not that we don't want the state, right? Or that the state even fundamentally needs to change, other than to actually extend these rights. And then finally, it may have had an impact that the group ultimately that the FARC accepted the peace agreement, and along with that, acknowledged the legitimacy of the Colombian state. And so maybe that had a kind of trickle down effect in areas where they had been the de facto rulers for so long. I don't know, it's just a sort of speculation. The other side of this puzzle of the results is that the paramilitaries are associated with this higher informal participation. And for me, that is more puzzling. I don't have similar qualitative evidence to say that the paramilitaries sometimes encouraged protests and strikes to the extent that the FARC encouraged engagement with state institutions. But the paramilitaries were extremely decentralized, so it may just be the case that we have a lot more to learn about all the variation in terms of the governance that they engaged in. So those are some speculations about the unexpected results. And then sort of to conclude, I think regardless of what the relationship or what the specific mechanisms are, there is some reason for optimism about the legacies of rebel governance for political participation here. So there's some new work trying to tease out how much mobilization through rebel governance has a positive effect following wars. And there seems to be very early mixed evidence. And I guess our evidence points more towards optimistic side of things than compared with some other work like Kubota's in Sri Lanka. And very recently in Cote d'Ivoire as well. But we are, if that optimism is warranted, then it might be that the democratic state could have more ability to sort of initiate and sustain public goods by supporting local collective action and sort of taking advantage of this kind of maybe raw material and willingness to engage in this kind of political engagement, these informal forms of political engagement, that could really help the peace agreement along. That's my optimistic, hopeful take. We have many next steps. Of course, this is still early work. And again, it's a working paper I'm happy to share with people, but does need to be revised. And we want to be able to try to understand the extent to which political participation also changes over the course of the implementation of the agreement. We want to take into account the role of victims' engagement with transitional justice institutions to see if that engagement also sort of generates new avenues for participation. But we have also a broader goal, like a public goods goal, which is to encourage other scholars to use this data, which is UNDP data. It's probably not yet available in the format that scholars would most like to use it, but we do have a data feature under review, and then we would have a data set ready for everyone to easily use. But it is public data, and I think I'd be happy to answer questions too about how you could maybe use it for your own work. But I hope it's helpful to others. So I will stop there and take your questions. Maybe I'll stop sharing too. Is that okay? So I can see more of you.
Great. Thank you so much. So before we jump into the discussion, I actually want to do something that I meant to do at the very beginning, which is to acknowledge that UBC is on the traditional ancestral unceded land of the Musqueam people. That the land that we're teaching and learning on is land that's been handed down from generation to generation among the Musqueam people and been a place of teaching and learning for thousands of years. And I also know that some of us are joining from other territories, and I want to recognize the stewards and caretakers of those lands as well. Also, before we take questions, I just have everyone's attention, also put in a final plug for the graduate student meeting with Abbey, which will, because of the 9-hour time difference, and thank you, Abbey, for staying up so late to be with us. Because of that time difference, the grad student session will take place tomorrow at 8 a.m. And if you haven't signed up for it, you still can. You're in your inbox, the email with the sign-up sheet, or email Chris Fernandez for details. Okay, so as usual, please use the raise hand function. We've already got a few people in the queue, and I will, as usual, also be prioritizing questions from students. All right, just getting myself, okay, Eve.
Great, thank you, Ellen. Abby, that was a fabulous talk, and this is such a great research initiative. It's very difficult to do surveys in post-conflict societies. So to do such a big one and do it twice, and to cover such a fine-tuned and well thought out variables, very, very difficult work. And yeah, thank you. This is fabulous. So one big thought I had, well, actually I have a very small empirical question, and then I have a bigger point or question. The small question is, when the referendum was defeated, where was the cause of the defeat? Was it more in FARC, formerly FARC occupied land, or was it more the middle class that may have supported the military government? Who really, all parliamentary, based on whatever the location. And then the deeper question behind it is, we often find in post-colonial states, without civil war, but within the political dynamics of politics, either minority groups or groups that believe the narrative of the post-colonial state, that it would fulfill the promise of public good and fairness, etc., and break with colonization, only to be disappointed when post-colonial lobby groups and interest groups that have an advantage end up co-opting all the state institutions, and the indigenous or minorities or whatever worse off, right? So there is that heavy structural realities in so many states, and when you don't have land reforms, it's even worse. So isn't the story that you found on the FARC side something of that sort? That is, we could make a story out of what you found, that either indigenous or disadvantaged groups got very, very disappointed by how the Colombian state was co-opted by, interest groups that were linked to the former colonial masters or whatever, and took up arms. But in the end, they're believers in the Colombian state and the project. They just wanted to go back to where it was. And then typically, then you would have the traditional interest groups blocking that transition. So the deeper question is, can a peace agreement after a near-death experience for a country like Colombia break the logjam of post-colonial lobby groups capturing the state? And that's the deeper question behind it.
Yeah, Alan, should I answer right away or?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for those questions, Eve. They're great questions. The referendum was largely supported. Oh, there you are. So you moved over. Was won super majorities in most of the territories of the Pedets that were targeted by the peace agreement. So very large. There's a strong association between violent events during the Civil War and the proportion of yes votes by municipality. So it was defeated in Medellin, really, if you want to pick a very specific place. But yeah, in the cities, it was defeated. But there was a big mobilization by the former president, Álvaro Uribe, who was very opposed to the idea that former FARC commanders could participate in politics legitimately, that they wouldn't have long enough sentences. And so that was a mobilizing factor for his former political networks on the one hand. And then the evangelical churches became mobilized because they heard that it was full of gender ideology. So there was this weird sort of catchphrase going around that there's an ideology of gender embedded in the peace agreement, which essentially which wasn't, exactly true, but referred to the emphasis on, for example, within the agricultural reform section, that women would be also have to be listed on land titles, and that there would be a specific effort to engage women across different, so that there was attention to gender, and that was there was a lot of propaganda about how women and men were going to be, women were going to turn into men or something like this. And then it rained really hard, like in your what is it, the book we read for research design in graduate school, right? It rained really hard in an area that Santos had his political machine on the coast. And so that depressed the turnout. So there were several things, some systematic, some less so, that led to this very narrow defeat. Okay, but I'm going on and on. So I tried to make my the bigger question, I will try to make a shorter answer, which is, yes. So I do think that there was a premise in all of the rebellions that if a liberal state actually did exist and functioned well, then there would have been no need for any of the insurgencies. Not all of the people who were participating in those, necessarily believed that, I don't think, but I do think many people did. And I do completely agree that traditional elites do not want to see some of the elements of the peace agreement actually implemented. And this is consistent with the past many decades, especially when it comes to land rights, property rights. There are lots of little tricks that elites do to make sure their rights are protected and exclude others from having equivalent property rights. So there's lots of undermining. They're very skilled at undermining. And then ultimately they retain the option to use violence at the end of the day if things are really not going their way. So, and so the update on Colombian politics right now is that the current president is this kind of elite. He's more on the sort of polite side of undermining, let's say, but he's certainly allied with others who are less polite in how they would undermine. But there's a new campaign happening now, and we will see if the next president is as willing to undermine the agreement or not. So I hope I answered your question. Sorry, it was long-winded.
Great, Max.
Yes, thank you very much, Abbey. This was really intriguing findings. And it would be really helpful to me, and so I imagine to others as well, if you could just give us a really good, concrete description of the kind of politics that rebel governance would involve. In my reading on Colombia, for example, I understand that there would have been municipalities where the paramilitary organizations would have come in and they would have put forward a candidate for office and then intimidated all of the other candidates to make sure that they won, so they would have a mayor that would give them access to resources, right? So that's kind of a story that I understand may have happened in many cases, and so I could see how that might sort of fit into the argument that you're making. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about? The juntas de acción comunal, I know about how community councils worked under Uribe, but I don't know much about the juntas de acción comunal. So how would they have worked, and how would the rebels, how would the FARC have been able to capture them or insinuate themselves into them and use them to extract state resources? Just give us some concrete description, because the terms sort of formal, informal, shared, centralized are so abstract that it's hard to kind of capture what you're actually talking about that's going on the ground in terms of urban governance.
Yeah, thank you. Now I'm also making a note to not get too carried away, because I love talking about these things. And I should say also, I would be happy to share the paper where there's more of this description too, for those of you who are interested. But from the FARC point of view, so what they would typically do, and so there's, let me start with the juntas. The juntas de acción comunal are operating in very small communities that are quite rural, and in neighborhoods within larger towns. The towns and these smaller communities and villages are all within one municipality. So you can easily have, and what often happened is that you have more paramilitary governance in the towns, because they were out in the open, they were less afraid of any kind of contestation with the state. And the FARC remain more in these more rural, dispersed areas. So that's one descriptive difference that I think helps. In the rural areas, the FARC would typically just kind of show up at a meeting of the junta, if it already existed, and explain what their goals would be and how they needed to, what they should do about achieving that goal, let's say. And that might be they attend that meeting already armed and like full on, where it's very clear what the dynamic is, but it's more often also they're wearing normal clothes and they say, we've noticed this road could use repair. We think you need to contact that so-and-so, this kind of more subtle infiltration and then it builds and builds and says, then everyone in the community needs to attend a meeting. And then they're going to get a lesson about how government does and should work, or this or that. So it's very, big and communal. And then in the piece that I was referring to in World Development, they even talk about how, every family had to send someone to work on the roads every week. Right? It was a contribution to public goods, and if you could not evade that, right? In these areas that the FARC governed. The paramilitaries operated more like you described, where their source of sort of authority came from above, right? So from the municipality, from the town, and the contracts that they would win. And then they would bring in other people, right, to do the work if they wanted work done. And they would just sort of impose on people. It wasn't like, let's solve this problem together. It was, my buddy's company is coming and I'm going to get a cut of it. And they're giving they were doing that with healthcare services, right? Not because they wanted to improve healthcare. So that's a little bit of a difference. And it's, again, very generic, but that's partly why it's surprising on the paramilitary side that we find this association with an increased willingness to engage in protests. So one possible hypothesis of that is that, you know, in spite of reporting having experienced this governance, it doesn't necessarily mean that you liked it, right? There's not a lot to like about that setup. And so you may be willing to react to something like that.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Okay. I'm glad I answered.
Feel free, by the way, people asking questions should feel free to follow up if you'd like to. Max, did you want to?
No, that's fascinating. It's really, really clear. And you're right. I think it does help us to get at the counterintuitive findings that you have.
Thanks. I'll be sure to include that in my next presentation.
Hey, Shula.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for a very engaging presentation, Abby. I have two empirical questions. The first one is about the measurement of the rebel governance itself. I understand that you asked individuals to actually report if they think they were governed, if they had a rebel governance. And I was wondering if these self-reports, to what extent they would actually match with the sort of like georeference data on like where FARC, ALN, or paramilitaries were actually active. I mean, you probably have this municipal level data of FARC's presence throughout the conflict, more or less. I was wondering how compatible they would be, because I wondered if people's memories, collections, or the accuracy of, you know, remembrance of the past, like whether what they thought about, like, oh yeah, there was FARC, they probably thought, but perhaps it was paramilitaries over ELN. And I was wondering, you know, if you could distill a bit more objective, if you will, like of this. And I'm going to ask all the questions so that you can just maybe collectively respond. And the second one is about the victimization. I'm very happy that you've done the sort of interaction with the displacement experience, because I guess this is like one of the most visible forms of victimization. But I was thinking, you know, like you've said that in the survey you have a module of wartime victimization. And I understand that beyond displacement, you've also measured other forms like homicide, femicide, sexual violence, forced disappearances. Like a lot of people have experienced this horrendous you know, forms of exposure to violence, I guess. And I was wondering if like controlling forum, or I guess maybe like creating an index of like the more trauma one has, I wonder if the more, you know, enticed they will be to participate. This is a different mechanism than the one that you're proposing, I guess, but you know, whether that would explain why you didn't observe what you expected. And also, you know, again, on the same point, displacement, I mean, I guess maybe it is more balanced. You probably know this better than I do, but I have an understanding that the experience of displacement is more common among women, or more displaced people are women. And I wondered if when you took out the displaced people, the fact that you found something for the informal aspect, especially, I wonder if it's like a gender effect rather than the displacement effect, and whether it might be worth exploring the gender dimension a bit more, because there is a gender gap in political empowerment in Colombia in general, and there's a gender gap in perhaps the experience of or with violence between men and women. And I wondered how all of this would play into the mechanisms of the results that you observed. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great questions. So I'll take them in order. We do ask people, did in your community, did this group ever rule? We also ask things like, who did you go to resolve a dispute, right? And gave an example of a dispute. And we tried to ask the small disputes, the bigger disputes, to try to get at how much governance. So we have alternative measures. We also have, we've thought about and even started doing, taking the average of reports within a block or within a community at the sub-municipal level, taking that as a sort of average benchmark of reported governance. But the problem is that we lose all of the IDPs by doing that because we can't attach them to their previous community, or we don't know, we can try to, we asked, what decade they arrived in, but that's not very precise. So there are trade-offs to everything. In terms of more non-survey based indicators of rebel presence or armed group presence and governance, that's really tricky because we mostly observe the violence and not the governance. So, and there's probably an inverted relationship between those two, right? Or that where we see the most violence, there's the least likely to be very sustained and stable rebel governance. So I have not seen, I've seen a lot of measures of violence, but I'm not sure, we don't have a very clear equation to get to a good indicator, a reliable indicator of governance. But I still think we should try the more aggregate community reports of governance as a check on people's memories and things like that, as you say. For the victimization questions, we don't have a battery of trauma questions. We considered it, and then we decided to discard it for ethical reasons. Because the survey is so big, we were worried that if we did, it would be very difficult to follow up with anyone that we might harm by asking that battery of questions with all of the enumerators. So we just ask a basic, were you victimized, in a very, so the only kind of victimization that is apart or disaggregated is displacement, because we ask, how long have you lived here? And did you come here because you left somewhere else because of violence? The other victimization question has the list of victimization forms where you would be eligible for reparations under the law. And so that's all kind of clustered together. So what we do now is we just control for that, because we do know that that there is an association found in lots of other settings between reported victimization and especially formal participation, but also in other settings, community leadership, for example, and interesting sort of psychological, socio-psychological mechanisms for that. And so what we wanted to try to do is to see, in addition to that, not to compete with that, but also to understand how governance on a more social level could also lead to a higher or different forms of participation. There's definitely more we can try to do with that, I think, to try to tease out different mechanisms. IDPs and gender, you're right that in general, I think it's about 65% of the displaced population are women, and then another significant proportion are children. We did check women's differences among women, and we didn't detect differences systematically in the general pool of respondents, although I will say that women are more negative about the peace agreement than men. So in general, they are just, I think, a bit more like, I don't know, right? Or there's a kind of level of skepticism that I think maybe you were also getting at. Like they're just not, I think they're just like, I don't know. But yeah, we will look more at that too.
No, that's expected. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for the questions.
Mm-hmm.
Mike. Hello, thanks again for the talk. Abbey is really fascinating stuff. I'm going to try to keep it pretty quick. I've got a few points, but two are pretty small. I think I want to second what you said to Max about thinking through more about the explaining why there's more, perhaps more informal mobilization in areas that were occupied by paramilitaries. I think your explanation potentially that people didn't like them and it actually generated a response is interesting. I guess my question is whether you can maybe get leverage over that somehow with the data in the survey about who in these communities are more likely to do that, or do we have outcomes about political preferences now that obviously it's hard to infer backwards, but maybe is there someone to get leverage to sort of find other points to like validate that perhaps, or at least indicate that there might be something to that story in the survey data. I think it's worth exploring. And one thing I thought was interesting too is that kind of along those lines is that kind of the joint occupation had basically no effect or negative effects, which I think like, again, might be consistent with stories about, presumably when power's changing hands, there's more reprisals, more violence, more uncertainty kinds of dynamics that might reduce cooperation. So it'd be interesting, again, like thinking through those dynamics more to think maybe there's a similar story going on that you could explore. I think the thing I want to raise, I'm not to be a party pooper about it, but more to think about like, not because I'm seriously concerned, but I think it's worth hearing more about it. It wasn't mentioned as much in the talk, is thinking a lot more about the selection process of which places received different types of occupation. I guess I'm just curious as to why not only were certain places, sustained in being occupied by FARC versus paramilitaries, but why were certain places able to avoid changing hands, for instance? So there's a reason to think like, well, why are certain places able to be resistant to other incursions, or we're not interested or not targeted for other organizations to come in? And there could be a selection process about the kinds of communities that are there. And one possibility is that the kinds of places that resisted handovers in power had more informal capacity to cooperate with the rebel governance of various types. And so that might explain why they never changed hands. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but I think it'd be worth hearing more and thinking more about why do certain communities end up with these certain types of regimes to begin with, and then their wartime experiences in terms of rebel governance, and thinking through how that might relate to the findings you're getting. Yeah, so that was it.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Those are really helpful questions. So on the first one, on trying to think about ways that we could pursue this sort of reaction effect. Oh, you disappeared. Goodbye. No, you don't have to. No pressure. No pressure. I love Zoom. So yeah. So one way to think about this, trying to get at this reaction mechanism. We have a question about victimization, about who, if they could identify their most recent, the most recent group who victimized them. Of course, most victims have been victimized more than once by now in Colombia, so we only say the most recent one. But to the extent that they would report that the paramilitaries victimized them, maybe that would get some way towards if they would maybe more willing to engage in this informal participation, but I have to think more about that. The selection process, yeah, I think this is a tricky one, but I hadn't thought about what you described. So why can some places avoid turnover? And I think your suggestion is plausible, that there would be an informal capacity to informal political, participation or collective action capacity could help a rebel group avoid being sort of, targeted or pushed out of a territory, maybe by, having a really good intelligence network or something along those lines. I think in general, most of the places where the FARC had any inroads that were in any way kind of urban or like going more towards the towns, those places were all destroyed in terms of their support base after the previous attempt at democratization in the Unión Patriótica. So any places that only report having only FARC governance, for instance, my guess would be that they are just super far away from anything, and that it wasn't worth it to the paramilitaries in their territorial consolidation. But I think it's helpful to think about that and how that might influence what we are interpreting from the results. I mean, the other selection process is one even before that, right? Is sort of how do these groups decide where to go to begin with, and does the existing capacity influence that? And of course, Ana Arjona's work suggests that the groups, at least somehow make choices based on that, especially about how they end up governing, but not whether or not they enter the community to begin with. So I don't have a good answer for you, but it's helpful to think through things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't expect an answer. I think, yeah, I think it's like any interesting question like this, I think it's going to be inherently fraught.
A mess.
Yeah, so I just think like, yeah, I mean, one of the things I think would be helpful is, yeah, just trying to think through these things is like, you know, I was suggesting one idea is where are these selection problems, and then think, okay, like, not to say you're going to solve them, but to sort of, give you more leverage to respond and think through what you can say and where you might be able to kind of tease something else out. The other thing that it struck me, it sounds like you didn't do this, but it came to my mind again as you're talking about this is like, I was curious more about like, do you have any questions about like kind of that disaggregate the kind of governance? Like, so you mentioned that you kind of asked who's doing it, but like, I guess the thing I'd be interested in is like, if FARC is doing all these educational things, like, yeah, it would be great to know like, where are they doing that, right? Those are the kinds of things I think would be nice, but it's.
Yeah, I mean, so just the helpful thing about the FARC is that it was really centralized. So they had pretty consistent, you know, on average, we would expect really similar engagement in terms of these, you know, meetings and things like that in communities. Yeah, they were really prioritizing that. Whereas the paramilitaries it was much more, I mean, as far as I know, they weren't having meetings like that. They were having more meetings like, gay people can't be here. Men have to cut their hair, right? They had these kind of social values rules that they would announce and impose, but it was not about, you know, the Colombian government is failing and you need to demand more from them. But yeah, we didn't ask more specific questions. Really, we found we did in focus groups, and in focus groups, we asked them sort of who used to be in charge and how they knew and what the rules were. And there it was more a discussion of the rules and how it was clear what the rules were. And then there was order when there were rules. And yeah, unfortunately, most of them in 2019 were talking about now new people are coming and we are scared because we don't know the rules yet.
Yeah.
We don't know who they are. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey,
Thank you.
Also, just want to also encourage grad students to put up their hand and ask questions. Yang.
Hey, Abby, thanks so much for this talk. It's a really impressive survey. I have 3 hopefully quick questions. The first is related to Mike's question about selection. I was thinking about sort of like the mirror image in terms of selection of households who stayed and like why they didn't leave. And then for IDPs, you know, the selection of like where they ended up going to because they're fleeing, you know, under a territory of one group and going to a territory of another. So just your thoughts on like the selection of the people that you interviewed when they stayed. Why is it because they couldn't leave? For people who left, you know, the selection of kind of where they ended up wanting to go to or able to go to. My second question is sort of related to Shulei's question on sort of possible social desirability and reporting on the surveys. Did your respondents know that the survey was being conducted by the UN? Or who do they think was conducting the survey, and how might that have impacted their responses? And then my last question was, you know, I thought it was interesting how you framed the political participation as formal or informal, but seeing the actions, I think another way that I could see it framed is like riskier political actions, protesting versus maybe less risky because you're participating in a way that's state sanctioned. So I wonder if like reinterpreting those actions might also make sense in terms of, you know, interpreting your results, riskier actions versus less risky. Thanks.
Thanks, Yang. Yeah, so I think the households who stayed versus, you know, not, I mean, I think it's really interesting in multiple ways. Of course, you know, this is my interest from my previous or earlier work. is who gets to stay, right? And what kind of choices do they make in order to do that and evade sort of often collective violence. But I think, so the way I've thought about that so far has been more the sort of, if the likely effect on their ability and willingness to participate in collective political engagement, but not in like selecting into different governance, right? And I think that's what you're getting at. And that's something I think is really important. And related to Mike's question, it's not just which places have the ability to avoid different rule, but which people avoid different forms of rule, because they don't always go to a place where a different actor is, right? They don't always know that, especially in these rural areas, they're super dispersed. So I was really, I was shocked by the percentage of people reporting that they were internally displaced, given where we were, right? So the most people go to bigger cities, but the proportion of IDPs living in these communities is just huge, right? So you're talking about communities that have been very fluid over time. So it's already interesting and I think important that there is willingness to engage in collective political action and informal, riskier forms, even though, you know, these communities are not like long-standing by most definitions, right? The members of the community have changed quite a lot in a short amount of time. But in terms of how that, you know, thinking from an individual perspective, like someone who moves and then experiences a different form of rebel governance by a different armed group, then how does that change their likelihood of participating or not? Or what kind of person is that to begin with? I don't know. I don't have a really strong prior about that, but I think it's helpful to think about it in those terms too. So both from the kind of community and the individual perspective. Social desirability. So yeah, it's always a possibility. For instance, it's strange how many people said they voted in the legislative election because turnout is not that high. So that was already sort of strange. Yes, we did say, we said it was a UNDP survey. It was funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway. So basically, for anybody interested in running huge surveys, like all it was sort of using PRIO to get the ministry to fund the UNDP and then, you know, volunteering to help them write the actual survey and this kind of thing. But the consent, the informed consent includes that it's a UN survey for the UNDP, and the contact is Michael, and Universidad de los Andes is a sort of institutional contact. I also haven't thought through like the fact that reported voting is so inflated. I don't really know what to make of that. Honestly. And then the riskier versus less risky, yeah, I think that is one way to frame it. I'm not sure that I can connect it so clearly theoretically with the governance mechanisms. It's not totally obvious to me off the top of my head, but I think my second alternative is more sort of the collective, like engagement that requires coordination with other people, because then that to me sounds like something that would have been influenced by generating norms of, you know, collective provision of public goods at the local level. But again, we see that that's also more likely if people report paramilitary governance to only paramilitary governance. So that's sort of my mechanism. I don't know if it's that it doesn't work or that paramilitaries were also doing something that I just don't know about, that also gave people this kind of impulse. I don't know. And thanks, it's helpful to think about these alternatives.
All right, well, I'll ask my question. So mine is kind of a meta question. I always find it really refreshing to see null or unexpected results because of, you know, the intellectual candor that it reflects and sort of the truth to the research process that it conveys. You know, you didn't go fishing. Doesn't look like you went fishing for a model specification that allows you to present results that support your hypotheses. You didn't ask us to like squint until we could see how the results really do support your argument. You know, this is just a really admirably open and honest account of the intellectual process you've been going through. And I think the discipline is perhaps slowly moving toward a greater appreciation of that kind of intellectual openness, but it still doesn't seem to be the norm in, at least if one looks at sort of the patterns of results in published work and sort of the standard kind of narrative of the research process that we see there. So I'd love to hear how you're thinking about how to write this up. As you said, you're willing to share the draft paper so we can get a sense of it from that. But maybe if you could just talk a little bit about how you and your co-author have thought about how to make the case for this study's contribution in a, you know, kind of professional disciplinary environment that still makes it hard to publish surprising results, null results, that sort of thing. Yeah, thanks. So that I don't know is my honest answer. I personally also like this. I mean, I think that there's a lot going on in the discipline that are sort of in parallel. So one is the sort of pre-registering your hypotheses and later testing. And we didn't do that partly for many reasons, like honestly, but maternity leave / moving to a different country / at the moment when all this is happening. And I think this is an alternative that should be just as embraced as pre-registration, in my opinion, because I do think if the goal is to learn something, then I think showing that our initial ideas about something, which are grounded in the literature, so they're not totally pie in the sky, right? We're trying to see if we can build on other people's ideas. And they don't turn out to be true, then it can generate a process of sort of collective reflection about why it might not be the case. So just like we just had, right? There could be all these selection issues. There could be conceptualization issues. There could be the fact that we are not, we just can't measure what we wish we could, or we're not doing that in the right way. So I feel like in the review process that that learning can happen too for both sides. And then the paper could be improved in the discussion section. But yeah, I think reviewers sometimes still say, well, why don't you frame it like this is your argument because it's what you found. And I don't think that that's a very good way to do social science as a community. But yeah, if you have suggestions for how to publish it, that would be fine. I think my co-author is a bit more nervous about it than I am. I have a secure job, so I don't care, honestly, if I get one more journal article. Like I also feel very free in that respect. I would much rather just be frank and try to find a place that will take our frankness. So, and then more seriously, a more serious suggestion that we did receive was to just scrap the theory and say, just put the empirics up front and then speculate, like what's happening here. And I think that's also a kind of middle ground that it wouldn't feel terrible to me. Because then it wouldn't be like, haha, we were right, at least. But it's a good question. And if you have advice, I'm open.
No, it's hard. And that's an interesting suggestion.
Yeah, well, thank you for, oh, Max, we're just about out of time, but Max, do you have a quick?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure it's a quick question, but yeah, if there's a chance to get you just to reflect on what you've learned about the nature of civil conflict, because hearing your talk has changed the way I think about this conflict. Less one in which there's a sort of Hobbesian state at the periphery where the state isn't present and these non-state actors are battling it out. And you seem to be telling a story about actors struggling for control over access to state resources. It's a different sort of understanding of the Colombian conflict. Has this changed the way that you think about civil wars generally?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I wish I could talk on and on about it. So if people need to go, I don't blame you. But I do think so. I do think in some ways the Colombian War is a bit different in how much of a state really does exist. So it is definitely not a weak state. It is present in most places. It is still failing to provide a lot of course, especially crucial public goods like order, or itself is the source of disorder. But I think it does force us to think more about how there aren't these binaries, and state weakness doesn't make much sense. So that is something that I've been trying to get a handle on, and not just say it's complicated. So to find some tools to think about it and understand it. And I just got Paul Staniland's new book, and I'm really looking forward to hearing if he can help me out of this conundrum. But I think other scholars have found similar dynamics elsewhere. So even in the DRC, which we really would consider quite different from the Colombian state in terms of its stateness, there's really interesting work about the role of bureaucrats and armed groups and how they interface there. And I do think that this is a really important area for future research. So thanks for the question, and I hope I have an answer for you that's more satisfying one day.
Well, Abby, thank you so much for joining us. I can't believe it's staying up till almost 11 p.m. talking about your research with us and generating such an interesting conversation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the invitation and all the great questions. And I do hope to see some graduate students tomorrow. Right, yes. You can wear your pajamas, it will be fine.
Grad students, yes, again, sign up if you haven't yet. And I hope next time we get to see you here in Vancouver in person.
I would love that.
And yeah, and thank you again. Okay,
thank
bye everyone.
You. Bye. 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 Up soon.